Comix Zone, released in 1995 for the Sega Genesis courtesy of the Sega Technical Institute, is a side-scrolling beat-em-up platform game made to look like a typical 90s comic book with tood and stuff. You assume the role of struggling comic book artist Sketch Turner, who somehow gets sucked into his own post-apocalyptic comic book by one of its main villains, Mortis, and now you must play the hero role if you want to get out of this predicament. Oh, and Roadkill, your pet rat, has also tagged along for the ride, and he'll prove helpful in a couple of cases, pulling switches that are out of reach, digging out possible items that might help you out in your quest to get out of this hellhole that you created, among other things. Comix Zone is primarily a beat-em-up, but one relegated to a single plane, and oftentimes you'll mostly be fighting one foe at a time, though sometimes a couple more will drop in to make life miserable for Sketch. Fortunately, you've got a few moves at your disposal. Pressing the attack button while fiddling around with the D-pad will net you different moves like spin kicks and uppercuts. Nothing too special, but it helps a bit. He can also block automatically when he's not on the offensive, though you can toggle a manual block button in the button configuration option if you prefer. Speaking of which, Comix Zone supports the 6-button gamepad right out of the box, which assigns the top X, Y, and Z buttons quick access to your 3 item slots, which can hold various items you'll find on your journey, including grenades, knives, health restoring tea, and the aforementioned pet rat. And control in Comix Zone, for the most part, relatively smooth, fairly responsive, no real complaints in that regard. With only 6 levels of play, Comix Zone is a relatively short game, but those 6 levels can be brutal to a fault, compounded by the fact that you only have 1 life and it's game over. And yes, falling into pits will kill you instantly, but this is one of those games where circumstances would earn you an extra continue or 2 along the way, not that it'd be much help. The combat can be somewhat challenging, sure, but those are often the easiest parts of the game, because then there's the panels that require you to overcome some other obstacle either through clever thinking or good old-fashioned brute force. Except brute forcing your way through things will cost you a bit of health. Punching a panel, shoulder blocking a door, among other such actions will slowly chip away at your health, and you don't always have the luxury of running into health pickups to store for later use. Oftentimes, items only pop up if they're dug up by Roadkill or possibly hidden in one of the many exploding barrels you'll find throughout the game. There's a certain approach and mindset you have to adopt when playing Comix Zone because of its rather unconventional approach to what is, on paper, a fairly conventional playstyle, and for some folks, that may be a barrier too high to overcome. But if you take the time to learn the game's quirks, memorize some of the trappings, work with what you've got, the rodent especially, there's quite a bit of fun to be had with Comix Zone, playing through the game, watching the various pages and panels play out before your eyes, and sometimes running into forks in the road. Do you take the next panel on the right or drop down below? There's a bit of a learning curve, sure, but give it time and you'll bring Sketch from 0 to hero in no time. And if that doesn't work, there's always a level skip code you could look up to help things out a bit. Comix Zone looks pretty damn slick, managing to replicate the art style of a typical 90s comic book from that era with its grungy dystopian backdrops that are packed with fine details in its line art. Character sprites look fairly decent, and while animation isn't silky smooth, it's still pretty good in action, and the little pop-up bits like Mortis' hand drawing extra characters or enemies bursting through the comic frames are rather nice touches. The only drawbacks I've come across are occasional bits of sprite flicker and slowdown for whenever the action gets a bit too intense, but that doesn't happen all too often, and whatever you want to say about the gameplay, when it comes to the overall visual presentation of Comix Zone, there is nothing here that can be considered half-assed. They clearly used their whole ass in making this look that damn good on aging Mega Drive hardware. Comix Zone continues the 90s vibe with its soundtrack, which tries to emulate that sort of grungy rock style that used to be a thing back in the day, and you've got some decent tracks on here that are quite catchy. Now, whether you're into that sort of thing or not depends on your mileage, but this sort of music does make sense since Sketch is also an aspiring rocker. Sound effects are a bit on the grainy side of things, but do pack quite a bit of punch when it comes to the more impactful stuff. Overall, Comix Zone is one of the finest Genesis outings to be released during the console's twilight years, a visually splendid and conceptually unique title that more than showed off the console's prowess in producing its own take on the interactive comic book. It is not a game for everyone, as the short length, odd gameplay quirks, and somewhat uneven difficulty may prove a bit unbearable for some players, and I wouldn't blame anyone for thinking that Comix Zone is more style than substance in that regard, but those who are willing to learn or put up with Comix Zone's eccentric gameplay aspects, or if all else fails, work around them, will find a satisfying romps of 90s attitude perfectly encapsulated in a meager 16-bit cartridge. It also saw re-release over a number of Sega compilations and Wii Virtual Console things over the years, and I think it's also on the Switch through the online Genesis gimmick, so yeah, give Comix Zone a try. It's one of the better Genesis titles not to come from Japan, so it's got that going for it, I guess, I suppose.